Hey guys, welcome to this video lecture about the origins of the Cold War Part 2. We are going to focus on the Soviet viewpoint of the emergence of the Cold War. Before we do that, let's take a look at two political cartoons which deal with this period. This is a British cartoon from July 1946. You can now pause the video, study the cartoon, look for symbols and think about what they mean. Alright, let's take a look at the cartoon together. This cartoon portrays the Iron Curtain that has descended on Europe. Winston Churchill is shown peeking to the other side, which refers to his Sinews of Peace speech. He is the person, the politician, who has understood and described before anybody else what is going on in the Soviet sphere of influence. The Iron Curtain has descended by order of Uncle Joe, which of course refers to Joseph Stalin, who is portrayed as the chief influence and instigator, because of whom Europe got divided into two blocks. The railway, which is cut off by the Iron Curtain, shows how unnatural the division into two blocks was, how the ties between countries have been severed abruptly. The cartoon also shows what the life on both sides of the Iron Curtain looks like. On the Soviet side, there is rebuilding, and the economy is working in high gear, while on the Western side, there is still damage and ruin from the war. From the point of view of the cartoonist, this is a warning pointing out that the enemy is rebuilding, while the Westerners sleep on the laurels of their victory, but among destruction. Here is another British cartoon, this time from June 1946. So again, pause the video, look for symbols and their explanations. The second cartoon portrays attitude of the British and the Soviets towards the US nuclear monopoly. It shows President Truman holding the A-bomb labeled private, which signifies the American refusal to share the nuclear technology with her allies or former allies. Truman is also showing a document, the 12 points, which we haven't talked about, but which discusses how the allies should respect the territorial integrity and sovereignty of the liberated countries. British Prime Minister Attlee and Soviet dictator Stalin seem reluctant to accept Truman's suggestions for cooperation. The caption mocks Truman's naive belief that there could be genuine cooperation and trust between the powers when the Americans are the only ones possessing a weapon with such destructive capability. From the British and Soviet viewpoint, this might actually look like more like blackmail than actual pleas for cooperation and mutual trust. This cartoon actually helps us understand the nervousness in Moscow due to the American nuclear monopoly. So let's now take a look at the origins of the Cold War from the Soviet perspective, from the viewpoint of Soviet Union's dictator Joseph Stalin. Stalin actually had several reasons why he distrusted his Western allies, and this distrust contributed significantly to the breakdown of the Grand Alliance at the end of the war. Stalin knew the Western countries had hated communism even before the Second World War. They actually tried to destroy it right after the revolution. On this map you can see the situation during the Russian Civil War after the October Revolution. You can see that the Americans, the French and the British dispatched troops to Russia during the Civil War. These Western troops supported the Whites in their struggle against the communist government in Moscow. Even though the Reds eventually prevailed, Stalin and other leading communists never really forgot and forgave the West for this. In the interwar period, Stalin tried to cooperate with the British and the French in order to prevent Nazi Germany from expanding. Eventually, though, he gave up as the British and the French were pursuing the policy of appeasement towards the Nazis. They seemed to be much more willing to negotiate and work with the Nazis than with the communist Soviets. So when during the war the Western Allies kept postponing opening of the Second Front, Stalin feared it was aimed against the Soviets, that the plan was to allow the Germans to fight the Soviets as long as possible, so that the protracted fighting weakens the USSR. The Soviets would then be no threat at the end of the war. The Soviet Union actually was weak at the end of the war. Soviet cities and villages were destroyed, and its economy was on its knees due to the 4 long years of fighting on Soviet territory. Stalin feared the Western Allies might use this weakness to attack the USSR and destroy the hated communist regime. Another extremely significant cause of Stalin's distrust of the West was the nuclear monopoly. The USA had the A-bomb, which they refused to share with the USSR. As a consequence, Stalin felt the Soviets could not defend themselves. Even though they had strong conventional forces, they would stand no chance if the Americans started dropping nukes on them. That would be like bringing knives to a firefight. All in all, Stalin felt that the USSR was weak and fragile because of the war, and that it was surrounded with hostile countries in possession of nuclear weapons. He therefore decided that the USSR needed a buffer zone on its western borders in case of a future invasion by Germany or the Western states. He decided to take control of the Eastern European states liberated by the Red Army. In these states, communists were very popular, as they had taken an active part in the anti-Nazi resistance. To boost the communist position in these countries even more, the Red Army secured important ministries in provisional governments for local communist leaders. The communists then used these positions of power to eliminate other political parties by accusing their leaders of sabotage, assassination attempts, or cooperation with the Nazis using fabricated evidence. To make sure that the communists won, the elections were rigged. After their victory, the communists proceeded to dismantle democracy in these countries. Of course, the West considered this to be an aggressive expansion, the export of communism to other countries, and destruction of democracy. From Stalin's point of view, the so-called Sovietization of Eastern Europe, as this process is called, was a purely defensive move. The attempt to increase the security of the Soviet Union by creating a protective buffer zone, which would shield it from a potential attack from the West. Stalin also considered some American actions to be extremely hostile towards the USSR, and he understood that he needed to react to them. For instance, he refused the Marshall Plan aid and called it dollar imperialism, a US attempt to gain influence in European countries. Originally, the Americans offered the Marshall Plan money also to the Soviets and the countries in their sphere of influence, but the Americans had some conditions. It is only natural when giving out free money that they wanted to check how it was used, so as to make sure it wasn't wasted or stolen. One condition they had was that they wanted access to Soviet accounting to see how the Soviets used the money. Stalin refused this, as it would reveal to the Americans the degree of weakness of the Soviet economy right after the war. He didn't want the Americans to know just how weak the USSR was at that time. Another condition was that the money was to be used to support private businesses. This was completely unacceptable to the Soviets, as there were no private businesses in the USSR, and the communists were not going to allow them to emerge. They had their centralized command economy, and they were happy with it. Thank you very much. Stalin also understood that the plan would increase American prestige and support in European states. So he refused it, and he also ordered Poland and Czechoslovakia, which lay in Soviet sphere of influence, to reject it too. Instead, the Eastern Bloc countries formed their own economic organization, the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, often abbreviated to, I kid you not, the Comecon. Another Western aggression, quote unquote, which Stalin felt he had to react to, was his former allies' behavior in Germany. This conflict over Berlin, also known as the Berlin Blockade, took place from summer 1948 to summer of 1949, and it was the first serious crisis of the Cold War. At the end of the war, Germany was divided into 4 zones of occupation. So was Berlin, which lay deep in the Soviet zone. The western zones of Berlin were therefore an enclave of capitalism deep within the Soviet sphere of influence. The USA initiated uniting the western zones into one, and a currency reform to strengthen the weakened mark. It was an attempt to get German economy back on its feet so that well-off Germans rejected communism. Stalin understood that the reformed mark would spread to East Berlin and maybe even the whole Soviet zone of occupation, as people always prefer to pay and be paid with strong rather than weak currency. So he reacted by blocking land access points to West Berlin with Red Army troops. As a consequence, West Berliners were under threat of starvation and, come winter, also freezing to death due to a lack of coal. The Soviet reaction was basically an attempt to force the Western Allies to abandon West Berlin and leave the whole city to the Soviets. However, to show their commitment to the Berliners, after all, containment meant that not even the tiny territory of West Berlin was supposed to be given to the communists. The Americans organized an airlift to supply West Berlin. In 11 months, 278,000 flights were made, which transported on average 5,000 tons of supplies a day. Here you can see several pictures from the Berlin airlift. It boosted the American prestige and popularity among the Berliners and West Germans in general, as the Americans spent a lot of money and risked incredibly just to save them from communism. It was a really tense situation, as at any moment Stalin could give the order to shoot down the planes from the sky, thus escalating the conflict and threatening to start the Third World War. Fortunately, Stalin never gave the order, and after 11 months he gave up. He realized the blockade failed to oust the West from West Berlin, so he called the blockade off. After the crisis, Germany got divided into 2 states: German Democratic Republic, West Germany, and Federal Republic of Germany. Oh no, German Democratic Republic is East Germany, and Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany. The division of Germany was thus cemented, and it would not end until 1990. As a consequence of the crisis, the NATO was established in 1949. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization was established as a military alliance of Western countries whose aim was collective security against the Soviet threat. This map shows the founding states of the NATO in light blue and the additions to the NATO by 1955 in dark blue: Turkey, Greece, and West Germany. The addition of West Germany to the NATO actually prompted the Soviets to establish their own military alliance, the so-called Warsaw Pact, in 1955. But that was already after Stalin's death, under the leadership of Khrushchev. Anyway, it is safe to say that with the official division of Germany into 2 states and the establishment of the NATO, the Cold War was on. Thank you for your attention.